Hello, my name is Anthony Miyaguchi, and today I'd like to talk about GeoLifeCLEF 2024, which I've done with the Data Science at Georgia Tech Club and as an ECE 8903 with Professor Vela. I worked with Mark, who is another OMSCS student, and Elmo, a first-year undergrad. I'll talk a little bit about the project, its overview, kind of how you would solve this kind of problem. I'll talk about the data set, the modeling that's been done so far, and some of the future work that needs to be done before the competition deadline. So CLEF is the Conference and Labs of the Evaluation Forum. It's an information retrieval and machine learning competition that is heavily focused on evaluation. There are 15 different labs in CLEF, spanning everything from natural language to computer vision, and they're all focused on information retrieval. So you have things like text summarization of medical documents, being able to extract information from PDFs, or being able to understand wordplay in text. So the group that I've been facilitating a lot this semester is focused on LifeCLEF. So these are ways of getting information from things related to the environmental sciences or biology. So we have BirdCLEF, which is all about extracting bird calls from long audio soundscapes, PlantCLEF, which is identifying species of plants, GeoLifeCLEF, which is figuring out the distribution of plants from satellite imagery and remote sensing data, SnakeCLEF and FugiCLEF to identify different species of poisonous animals and plants. So the conference kind of takes a yearly cycle. It starts in December when registration opens to when the competition starts, roughly January to February. Most of the deadlines are at the end of May, and then the conference itself happens in September. So GeoLifeCLEF is focused on the estimation of plant species and how they're distributed across Europe. There are 5 million different occurrences in this data set, and the goal is to predict whether a plant species is going to occur or be absent in a particular location on the map. We're given satellite imagery, we're given multispectral time series data, we're given information about the environment in rasters, and this ends up being a really challenging problem. It's a multi-label classification problem. And the domain is really challenging. It's a computer vision type of problem. I was really interested in this problem because I work for a company that deals with satellite imagery, Planet Labs. And when I looked at this problem, I first thought of the different things that I would want to play with and ways that I would go about solving that problem. This all culminated into a proposal document that I sent to Dr. Vela to ask if he would supervise a 8903, a special problems section. And so the solution sketch that I came up with is basically taking all this training data in the form of rasters. So we have satellite, we have things like temperature, we have things like land cover, and building and embedding a low dimensional representation of the data. Here, TileDevec is the model that I was really interested in, which takes a contrastive approach using the distributional semantics of satellite imagery. Basically, tiles on a map that are close together, so two patches of images of the map that are within a certain radius are going to be more similar than two tiles that are far apart. And by learning enough from these examples, you can build an embedding space that can be used for downstream classification tasks. But basically, we do this transfer learning process. We take a space that has semantic meaning for the task in the domain. We embed those, and then we build some sort of classifier or ranker to get probabilities of a species occurring at a specific location. The proposed pipeline of different techniques is shown here. And so there are a couple of techniques at the beginning of the semester that I really wanted to take a look at. First was TileDevec, which is an unsupervised embedding for geospatial data. The second is a Koopman estimation. This is learning the dynamics of a system. And the way that these dynamics are learned are typically through linear methods like singular value decomposition. The third thing I wanted to play around with was ordinal regression. So instead of doing a multi-class classification, you can instead try to predict at a specific location what is the order of the species that would occur at a particular tile. And finally, I was interested in learning a little bit more about Gaussian mixture models. So you use a bunch of Gaussians and their relative location in some space, and the sum of these Gaussians gives you a distribution that can be learned from the data. This would be really useful to get rasters of where the species are most likely to be. With this, I put together a proposed schedule that went through the whole semester. So the first 4 weeks was all about exploratory data analysis and data engineering. Then there would be 8 weeks of modeling, spring break, and finally doing hyperparameter tuning. But like any plan, this isn't necessarily how things worked out in practice. So now I'll go over the work that was done with the data set, the modeling, and the future work that is left. The data set is fairly large. It's 70 gigs of compressed data. We have 30 gigs of satellite image patches. We have satellite time series. We have environmental rasters. And the most important data structure here is a GeoTIFF. A lot of information that is associated with spatial attributes gets stored in images. So for example, you might have a GeoTIFF that has information about the elevation at any given point on a map. Instead of storing RGB, you would instead store a byte or a float that represents the elevation at that pixel. This is a very common format to store data in this domain. The first things that we needed to do is to convert these rasters into tiles. Having tiles that are associated with the very specific classification problem that we needed to do is the best way for us to be able to experiment with supervised techniques. We might have one GeoTIFF that is 11 gigabytes large that represents the entire map, and this isn't conducive for the task at hand. So we need to cut these into smaller squares and then turn those squares into features that we can use for our models. The first thing is to just pre-process image patches. They're organized by geolocation and ID, and we actually convert these into Parquet files. And so you can imagine this as taking a bunch of images, concatenating them together with their metadata, and putting the metadata and the images in separate columns. And this is really useful when we're using object storage. These are places where you have a put and a get interface for your data. And when you have lots and lots of images, millions of images, the overhead of doing the function calls for getting data can be significant. It's better to have everything into blocks or chunks or partitions for data processing. We also generate tiles of all of the image rasters. So we actually have quite a few different image rasters. We have, I think, around 20 to 30 different types of rasters, covering everything from croplands to population density to railways and roads. We use some of the data loaders that the competition provides in order to convert from a survey ID into a tile that represents that data in the 128 by 128 pixel region. If we were to use these data loaders directly into something like a PyTorch model, we might actually run into a lot of issues related to memory, because for each of these, we have to load the entire GeoTIFF into memory. And again, we have a couple of GeoTIFFs that are over 10 gigabytes in size. Many of them are small, under 10 megabytes, but there are some large ones. And so it's useful to just pre-compute all of these tiles so that we can play around with different techniques and we don't have to worry about this pre-processing step. So now we go on to the initial modeling. For our model, we build a baseline. So this is the simplest model that we want to improve on. And so the model that we try to design is a logistic regression from the latitude, longitude, and day of year. We can actually even simplify that further to just the latitude and longitude. And we choose a logistic regression because it's a linear model. So we're basically just fitting lines. We use the 5 million rows that we have, and we train this against the top 10 species. And we get an accuracy of 0.09, which is not very good, but it's something to start at. So now that we have this basic model, we want to get better features for this. So we have features that are based on the raster data, and we can take low dimensional representations of that using the discrete cosine transform, which is used in JPEG for compression, or PCA, which is a very common dimensionality reduction technique in the machine learning community. Additionally, we want to try out Tile-DeVec, but there are significant modeling challenges that we ran into. The first being that trying to learn a logistic regression model is actually prohibitively expensive because of the large number of classes. There are 10,000 classes and we have 4 million survey sites. In PySpark, computing the multinomial logistic regression is done via stochastic gradient descent, and we have to carry around k by j coefficients, j for the number of features and k for the number of output classes. We find that if we run this, it will run for several days without finishing on a 16-core machine. If we try to run this in a model on our local machine, like using sklearn, then it will just run out of memory. So we're not able to actually build a logistic regression model. We find that this is the case with SVMs, with decision trees, with XGBoost. We have a really hard time building a simple model that's able to go from just the features into one of the 10,000 species. So instead, we play around with k-nearest neighbor models. We use locality sensitive hashing to generate a k-nearest neighbor graph. And we use the k-nearest neighbor graph directly to compute a result. Here are the modeling approaches that we plan to take. We've done several of these and we're evaluating the different approaches, but the actual scale of the problem makes this a challenge to build something simple and to iterate on that simple approach. So first is the k-nearest neighbor model that we talked about. We have the linear regression using techniques from this extreme multi-label or multi-class domain. We have more feature engineering with the raster and time series data, and then more feature engineering with embeddings that take advantage of the locality of the k-nearest neighbor graph. The KNN model ended up being the only model so far that was computationally tractable. Building the KNN graph itself takes anywhere between an hour or two because of the number of edges and nodes. We have 4 million different survey sites and we have 10,000 different species. The number of edges in that graph is pretty significant, but using locality sensitive hashing, we're able to get a pretty reasonable KNN graph. And here we use a KNN graph where we have the 10 nearest neighbors with a radius of 5 kilometers around each site. So just using the latitude and longitude projected into a space where the Euclidean distances match up to real world distances, we find that our model does about as well as taking the 25 most frequent species and using that as the prediction. So we have this 0.11 on the actual leaderboard. The best score as of April 30th is 0.33. There are a couple of techniques that are just based on the most frequent species, whether it's within a district or within a country or within the entire data set, that do better than this approach. But this is computational tractable as opposed to trying to build a logistic regression against the features. In order to get around the large number of classes, we've tried doing something where we build up a low rank label space. So you can imagine taking all 10,000 species, but treating this as a multi-label problem. One technique that we try is to learn a relationship between the features and a vector in a low dimensional label space. We compute the DCT or the PCA on the label space. And we find out that first, the DCT doesn't work very well. We are trying to represent the signal using the sum of sinusoids. On the right, we see what it looks like when we have a very sparse signal. We have 6 different indicators within this vector. We use the 16 coefficients corresponding to the lowest frequencies in the data. And we find that when we reconstruct the signal, we get this very smoothed out looking signal. We find that this representation is not good enough for us. It takes 30 minutes to learn one relationship between the features and the independent variable. Whether it be logistic regression or XGBoost, it takes about 30 minutes to learn. It would be prohibitively expensive if we had to learn more than 4 to 8 different classifiers for this. We're still investigating what it would be like if we did something that was similar to latent semantic indexing. So we take the PCA of the label space, and then we learn a relationship between the features and each of the coefficients of PCA. And then we do a nearest neighbor search to figure out what's the original vector that corresponds to this label. And finally, it would be interesting to, instead of using a low rank label space, to instead partition the label space by frequency. So we learn a classifier between, say, the top 1,000 most frequent species and the features, and then the next 1,000 and the next 1,000 after that. So this might actually be a way that would solve the big disparity between the frequency of all the species. We have a long tail problem, and this might be a useful technique to reduce the complexity of the problem and allow us to learn at the same time. So future work involves building a classifier that can actually learn from these geospatial features. We may just have to learn a neural network instead of relying on classical machine learning techniques. And then once we can learn a classifier on the geospatial features, then to take into account all of the raster data and all the time series that we've computed before, and to actually be able to compare the very naive baseline to other features like the actual satellite imagery or the population or the number of roads. We also want to try out the KNN classifiers, but instead of using the geospatial data to build the KNN graph, use the other raster time series features to build those. It'd be an interesting point of comparison in the final working notes. And finally, we want to actually build the working notes. So our working notes are due at the end of May, and the competition ends a week before that. So there's a little bit of time to explore some of the different models. So that is it for GeoLifeCLEF 2024. There's still a lot of work to be done, and this semester has been very fruitful in terms of trying out different approaches, doing the data preprocessing, and kind of working through a research problem from start to end in a competition-like format. I'd like to thank my teammates, Mark and Elmo, as well as Dr. Vela for supervising the ECE 8903 section. So thank you.